Welcome, people, to another episode of the Watchdog. This is Lowkey. As you know, weekly we are covering stories which are marginalized by the mainstream media. I am absolutely so ecstatic to be joined today by one of my favorite investigative journalists, Matt Kennard. We're going to be discussing quite a few different issues, but firstly, I would like to point to some of the things coming up in the news as we speak. We've seen Boris Johnson coming under pressure for claims that he personally intervened to facilitate pen farthings, as some see it, animals first, people second policy of escape from Afghanistan. But one of the themes of today's podcast will be the inattention to detail that has been paid to some of these organizations, whether media organizations or ones operating in theaters of war. So looking into the Nozad charity of pen farthing at the UK Charity Commission, I found that not only pen farthing was not listed among the three directors of the charity, but there was a gentleman by the name of Dan Tatch. He, according to the Charity Commission, is the chair of the Nozad animal charity that pen farthing has been running in Afghanistan throughout the occupation of the country. Now, Tatch is a former US Army captain and is the current vice president of Hillwood. Hillwood is a company with an oil and gas exploration section which won big off the occupation of Iraq. Now, the CEO of Hillwood Investments, which is the section of the company that Tatch works for, goes by the name of Todd Platt. Now, Todd Platt sits on the Military Services Advisory Committee for the George W. Bush Presidential Center and is described as an active supporter of numerous military causes. The overall chairman and founder of Hillwood, though, is Ross Perot Jr. He is the co-chairman of the East-West Institute with George Bush. Perot was a director of the Business Executives for National Security Group, and his former firm, Perot Systems, also had multiple contracts with the US military. On a personal level, Perot, through his foundation, funds the Sherry Blair Foundation. He funds the Anti-Defamation League. He also funds the George W. Bush Foundation and other pro-war, pro-military causes. In a country which is believed to have huge undiscovered oil and gas reserves worth billions, a connection like this really should have been worthy of note by our media. Also, we have seen the Israel lobby in this country escalate its war against academia by targeting Palestinian academic from Gaza, Shahid Abu Salama. Originally, claims were released by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism in the Jewish News, claiming that she fostered hostility against Jewish people. These claims were sent to her university, Sheffield Hallam, where she was promptly removed from the course she was about to be teaching on, and the course itself was suspended. This is, of course, a great disservice to her students, but also to someone like her who has suffered greatly at the hands of the Israeli occupying forces. Now, we know that the head of political investigations at the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, an organization set up in 2014 during Israel's campaign in Gaza, which killed over 2,000 people, their former head of political investigations, Joe Gleisman, actually took credit on behalf of the group for the defeat of the Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party in 2019. He said, and I quote verbatim, "The beast is slain. Corbyn has been slaughtered." And he claimed that the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism were able to defeat Corbyn through the use of what he used the words "our spies and intel." It's important to also remember that the chief executive and founder of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, Gideon Falter, is the vice chair of the Jewish National Fund, which raises money for settlements on Palestinian land and directly builds illegal settlements on Palestinian land. It has also given financial support to Ayn Pratt, which is a military leadership program which takes young people from North America and attempts to militarize them on a military base in the Naqab Desert. So for all those wondering, the quote unquote Negev Desert is not only used by the JNF to plant trees, it's also used to militarize children. The first director of communications at the campaign against anti-Semitism was Jonathan Sakadotti. Sakadotti worked for GB News and was a director of the Zionist Federation at the time. Another founder of the campaign against anti-Semitism is, of course, Joseph Cohen, who founded the Israel Advocacy Movement. Also, we have seen extreme brinkmanship exercised vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine by the British and US governments, seemingly differing from their EU allies. We've seen thrust to the fore Fiona Hill, formerly very high up and well connected, girl from Durham in the US government. However, it was not mentioned when she appeared on BBC Newsnight that Fiona Hill is a current employee of the Brookings Institution. That's an organization which is funded by arms companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and the actual US Army. We also have to remember that when Raytheon's CEO says, we don't make policy, that actually the current defense secretary of the United States is Lloyd Austin, formerly a director of Raytheon. As we will get into, also, we see Raytheon's involvement very far in funding think tanks who act directly to influence policy, like RUSI, Atlantic Council, Center for Security Policy, which gave us the Muslim ban, the Lexington Institute Security and Defense Agenda, which is now known as Friends of Europe, Reform, a neoliberal think tank, the Center for New American Security, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Middle East Institute, and as I mentioned, the Brookings Institution. Also, on top of that, Raytheon and its affiliates spent over $11 million on lobbying people who make policy in 2020. They donated over $500,000 to Joe Biden. They donated almost $500,000 to Donald Trump. And many of us will be surprised to know that Raytheon and their affiliates actually donated over $150,000 to Bernie Sanders. Also, a director of the arms giant Raytheon, Stephen Hadley, serves simultaneously as a director of the US Institute for Peace. One of the most cynical examples of Raytheon astroturfing support for them is, of course, their funding of what describes itself as the largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization in the US, the Human Rights Campaign, which surprisingly awarded the arms giant with a perfect score for corporate equality. Of course, previously, we know the Human Rights Campaign has also awarded Jeff Bezos, somebody who through Amazon also funds the Human Rights Campaign. So here to talk to us about the astroturfing of support for big, powerful actors in the world, and to tell us more about his fantastic research into the National Endowment for Democracy, we would today like to talk to Matt Kennard about the NED and whether Declassified is expected to receive funding from NED anytime soon.
Yeah, we got a grant application pending, and we're pretty hopeful, to be honest, especially after that last article. But yeah, I mean, so I'll just explain quickly about the article that we did, effectively, and a little bit of the history of the NED, because it's like what you're talking about. They kind of always work the same kind of way, you know, these astroturfing things. It's a state operation that needs some kind of excuse to present it as a social good. And there's tons of ideology then put on top of it, often to do with freedom and democracy and openness and all this kind of stuff. So the NED actually is quite an interesting one because it was created quite consciously in the 80s by Reagan and his administration, because covert operations being run by the CIA were getting them into a lot of trouble. There was Watergate, and then there was Iran-Contra. There were all these operations where covert financing of different groups was being exposed, and they were having to defend themselves. So the kind of brainchild of Reagan, and in fact there was a guy called Alan Weinstein who was the director of the research study which led to it. They sort of thought, why don't we put some of these operations out into the open? Why don't we just like have a organization which funds pro-democratic, pro-freedom groups, and people can look at how much they're getting and who we're funding. Now, the other clever thing about the NED was the structure that they created was that it was a private non-profit. So it wasn't technically part of the US government, although it's funded wholly by US Congress. And of course, there's a porous border between the NED and the US government, well, in terms of personnel, strategy, everything. They've got a 22-member board. 5 of those people are former US ambassadors. So it's a government thing. But what it means is that people who are taking that money now, a lot of groups, I think, rightly have a policy that they shouldn't take national government funds because it skews what they do. If you're promoting press freedom or you're doing investigations, obviously, if you're being funded by a state, that's going to skew what you're covering, even in an oblique way. But what the NED structure allows is that groups can say, well, the NED isn't the US government; it's a private non-profit that just happens to be financed. Anyway, so this was created in the 80s. Now it became it expanded rapidly, and it was created in 1983, which was still at the height of the Cold War. And they plowed money into Eastern. It was mainly into Eastern Europe, and it was about basically trying to destabilize the Soviet Union, the satellite states of the Soviet Union, obviously they weren't democratic, so there was a good excuse. And but what happened at the end of the Cold War is it wasn't kind of it didn't shut up shop. It expanded even more. And it expanded to different regions. So the projects in Latin America, in Asia, really picked up. And actually, you can kind of see that they correlate to where the US government is worried about either governments that are independent of Washington or with the potential to be independent. So the NED was a huge player in Venezuela, for example, after Hugo Chavez won the elections of 1998. And moved Venezuela for the first time for a long time outside of the orbit of the United States. Now, the NED became very concerned about democracy in Venezuela after that, and plowed money into funding these groups. One interesting grant, which was given in 2011 when Chavez was still alive, was to fund 10 rock groups to make new songs about freedom of expression. And actually, that only came out in a Freedom of Information Act request. That wasn't actually published on their website. And just to say, another point which we found when we were doing the research was that it's quite clear democracy is not, and freedom is not the priority of the NED, because we couldn't find one grant given in any of the 6 US-backed dictatorships: Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, Qatar. You know the ones. There's 6 of them that are propped up by the US and the UK. Not one of those countries received not one group, pro-democracy group in those countries, received an NED grant that we could find anyway. So you see that it's effectively about projecting American power rather than projecting freedom and democracy. But the story we did was that actually they've moved quite significantly into the UK media space since 2016. This is obviously worrying for anyone who cares about foreign interference in our democracy, and if you look at the groups that they funded, they're some of the most important press freedom groups. So, for example, Index on Censorship received £600,000 from the NED in the 4 years to 2021. And they obviously have a reputation and a degree of power within British society, and yet they're being funded by the US government. And also the other thing about about Index is that they were founded in 1972 by the poet Stephen Spender, who had 5 years earlier quit from Encounter magazine after it was revealed that Encounter had been funded by the CIA. So you can see that you can delineate a long line, not just with Index, but a lot of different groups where the CIA and through its kind of adjacent institutions like the NED, and in fact, I want to qualify that because people will say, well, you can't just say that. Philip Agee, the CIA whistleblower, he called the NED the CIA sidekick. So, and he's not just anyone; he served within the agency itself. So that it's not just me saying that. But anyway, so when you have CIA adjacent institutions funding some of those important press freedom groups, that's a big problem for our democracy. And you can see it actually in Index's coverage of press freedom. It very, very closely follows the priorities of the US government, and in fact focuses on target countries of the US empire. Now, I'm not going to defend the regime in Belarus, and in fact, I think it's a noble thing to promote democracy in Belarus. But if you're doing that every day and ignoring the US-backed dictatorships, which are in fact much more repressive even than Belarus, so Saudi Arabia, UAE, places like that, then that's not a serious principled organization. That's one who's becoming a tool of a foreign power that wants to project its power. So that's where I had the problem with that. The other point about Index is in 2020, in June 2020, 6 months after she lost her seat in Parliament, Ruth Smee was appointed CEO, and it had been revealed by WikiLeaks in 2010 that she had been an informant for the US Embassy. There was a cable that was leaked that named her as a strictly protected informant. So again, you're seeing that there seems to be a lot of influence within Index, but this does go across the spectrum of the US government within the UK. Now, if this was Russia, this would be a massive scandal. Even a tiny percentage of this came out, it would be a massive scandal if we found out that journalists, that press freedom groups were being funded by Russia. But because it's the US, it's assumed that this is okay. It's assumed that we can just we're a vassal of the US. Our discourse can be completely distorted by the US, and it's not a problem. And for me, and I think anyone who actually cares about the principles of press freedom and journalism, that's not something we should accept. And I found since 2016 that the NED had given £2.6 million to investigative groups and press freedom groups. Some of them are good. For example, Open Democracy is a good organization. They do really important investigations and have done of UK government wrongdoing for years now, and they got grants in 2015 to 18. But it's important that the NED is problematized, because I think for a lot of people it puts out a lot of ideology and a lot of propaganda about what it does. But when you look under it, you realize it has much more nefarious purposes. So I'm sure the people that accepted those NED grants for Open Democracy weren't aware of that, or at least didn't have the whole story. But when you look at that and you see that they were being paid to recruit and train people to write articles in the Middle East, you realize there's huge problems with that in terms of independence and in terms of the content that comes out. And it's quite difficult to find a direct effect on the work itself from these grants, because obviously we don't have access to the contracts. There might be this isn't specific to any organization, I'm just saying generally sometimes they might put provisos in the contracts over what that money is being used for, and maybe editorial control, I don't know. But the point is we don't have access to those, so we don't know what kind of control is being exerted through these grants. But it's wrong, and it's obviously a state interference in the UK. And in this kind of table of who's interfering most in the UK, the US is way out in the lead. but no one ever talks about it because it's a state ally, and Russia is a state enemy, and journalists follow the state generally. So they run around hysterical about Putin's what he's doing here, but don't say barely anything about the US. And that's because there's no other reason. It's not because they've evaluated the evidence and thought that Russia does more stuff. It's merely because that's the state has decided that, and they follow the state.
On that subject, we remember that Catherine Cadwallader had previously been included in the Integrity Initiative, which was part of the Institute for Statecraft's campaign, really. The Integrity Initiative included several defense correspondents, Deborah Haynes, for example. I wonder what your perspective is on Carol Cadwallader, not Catherine, Carol Cadwallader's anti-Russia activism. What do you think of it?
Yeah, well, firstly, I should say I do support her in the legal case with that she's in with Aaron Banks, who's sued her for libel. I think that if you look at the case itself, it is a clear what's called a slap. Like it's about making sure she can't participate in public conversations. So I do support on that. But one of the revelations that came out of that case was that this is from her own testimony, that she was receiving intelligence files from an unnamed contractor that was working for the UK government about Aaron Banks, and we don't know what else, but one of the files related to Aaron Banks's wife, who's Russian, and included an analysis of her passport number. That needs explaining, in my opinion. So I think any journalist that's receiving intelligence files from government contractors about targets needs to explain what was going on there, and we don't know the full extent of it. It relates to something I've covered as a journalist, because she was one of the main conduits through which a lot of the innuendo about Assange's alleged relationship with Russia was coming out in 2017 and 2018. Now, the context for this was that the CIA had become gone up a gear, as was revealed in that Yahoo News investigation. After the Trump administration came in, they okayed a whole new raft of disruptive operations, which came under the rubric of, because Pompeo made this speech calling WikiLeaks a hostile intelligence agency, which meant that it opened up a whole new panoply of different means through which they could disrupt them and even assassinate them. They drew up plans to assassinate Assange. But one of these was to plant information which would sully the reputation of Assange and WikiLeaks and whatever else. So there was a lot going on. There was obviously a lot of information passing from intelligence agencies and states to journalists to try and destroy Assange as a prelude to getting him out and getting him in Belmarsh. Now she wrote a stream of articles which, with very little evidence, in fact no evidence, all circumstantial stuff, basically saying Assange and WikiLeaks were the center of this conspiracy by Russia to disrupt the US elections in 2016. There was one particular one about when Nigel Farage visited the Ecuadorian embassy, and in the article she wrote about that, she quoted a source with, this is the quote, a senior source with close links to the US intelligence establishment or something along those lines, who imputed in his or her quote that Farage was acting as a human courier, and that he would have effectively saying he was giving him information, the innuendo also being it was from Russia. Now, that is complete rubbish from what we know from the public record. The Mueller report basically said that WikiLeaks or Assange had got that information from a source on the internet, not someone who delivered a USB stick to him. But also, secondly, There was no evidence that that meeting was anything other than about an interview that Assange was going to do for LBC, and there was an LBC producer with Farage that came out but wasn't mentioned by Cadwallader in the article. So this whole sort of sinister plot was it looked to be invented, and this formed part of a wider Guardian campaign against Assange in that period from May 2018 until December. There was a whole stream of articles basically saying that Assange was a Russian asset. There was this whole one about him being the Russians had a plot to get him out, which the Guardian had to eventually apologize for. And then the plan was that stopped in December with the Manafort, infamous now Manafort front page, which alleged that Manafort had visited Assange in the embassy, which turned out to be complete fabrication. Again, who gave that information to them? What kind of op was happening there to get that information out to those journalists? That wasn't Cadwallader, that story, but she was part of this whole operation. The plan that we know from Foreign Minister Alan Duncan's diaries was to get Assange out the month after, in January 2019. That had been the original plan. There was something went wrong. The president got cold feet, and it was delayed until April. But basically, that whole period from March to December 2018 was a prelude to the January eviction of Assange and throwing him in Belmarsh, where he still is today. That eventually happened in April, obviously. So the problem is that you're not allowed to. No one asks these questions. The interesting thing is that there's barely anyone even noticed that Cadwallader was receiving these files from the UK intelligence, UK government contractors, and it appeared in the Guardian, yes, in the story as a kind of a description of what had happened in the court, but there was no follow up,
as if it was an unremarkable normal thing.
Exactly, and it wasn't problematized in any way. Now, if it was like. The funny thing is that her argument is that Aaron Banks was a useful idiot of the Russians, right? She kind of says that he might have been used by them, but it seems like she was being used by the UK and the US. So that didn't really make sense to me. And if Aaron Banks was receiving intelligence files from the Russians about Cadwallader, that would be a serious problem, wouldn't it? But yet the other way, it doesn't. There's kind of some kind of cognitive dissonance that people don't see it as a problem for some reason. Anyway, so I think that, but Cadwallader's part of it. But she won the Orwell Prize. She became a hero of the liberal UK establishment, and she was part of a whole wave of journalists that rode on the surf of Russiagate, effectively. And it happened in the US too with Trump, and it happened here with Brexit. You know, like the idea that disorientated liberals could not understand how Brexit happened, and they couldn't ever look in the mirror and think maybe it's partly the neoliberal policies we've been pushing that has impoverished millions of people. So they needed some way out, you know, some sublimation, and Russia was the perfect thing. Obviously, that wouldn't have gone anywhere if it wasn't in someone else's interest as well, which is the UK state. So the UK state was loving this, you know, and the liberals and the alliance between liberal journalists and the national security state goes on to this day, but it became really, really pronounced during the time of Trump and Brexit, when Brexit was trying to be reversed. So she rode a wave that many, many other journalists rode, and nearly everything those people wrote has turned out to be wrong. Like, for example, I don't know if you remember before the Mueller report, there was so much excitement. Mueller was being presented as this great hero that was going to finally prove that the Russians did Trump. And then there was no evidence. It happened here. I remember before the Russia report, where everyone, and this is one of my favorite things that's happened recently, is like that everyone was going nuts in the liberal sort of establishment sector about the Russia report. Why the Tories are not releasing it? It's so damaging to them that they won't release it. Then it comes out and it's like, okay, we've got no evidence that the Russians had any impact on the Brexit vote. So they're all kind of like, after months of like hysteria, thinking, what can we say? Okay. The new one is they didn't find anything because the UK government wouldn't let the security services look. And you're like, come on, no one believes that. I cover this stuff, right? the idea that the security services weren't aware of Russia, like in 2016, and they weren't, is preposterous. But in fact, that is now the line of the sort of liberal intelligentsia as to why there was no evidence, is because the UK government, for some reason, because it's in the pocket of Putin, would not let MI5 investigate Russian interference. Anyway, so yeah, it is so bananas. It's so awful, so much of the journalism that came out of that period. But it's what happens when journalists get used by states. And it doesn't just, obviously it happens everywhere, man. That it's not just the UK, but this is states need to control discourse, need to control narratives, and they leak information, give information to journalists all the time to try and do that. There's such a large percentage of intelligence agencies' operations is about PR. That's what people don't understand. It's like they're constantly trying to fight an information warfare campaign against whatever target it is, and journalists should be aware of that and are aware of that when it comes to Russia, but they're not aware of it when it comes to their own states. There's this idea that Russia does it, but not the UK and US. We don't do it. We're a bit different, which is preposterous. So for me, that was the most interesting thing that came out of that trial, because, as I said, this happens all the time, but you don't often get hard evidence of it because it's all done in a hush-hush way for reasons that it's embarrassing. But this time you saw very explicitly that government contractors, so effectively the government, were handing information to journalists about targets. That's worrying.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other symptoms of liberalism in this period of time in the UK is a kind of tireless stating of love for Rory Stewart, former Tory MP. And one of the examples of this journalistic lack of critical thinking or critical questioning has to be the parading of Rory Stewart on an expert in Afghanistan for his work with his organization, Turquoise Mountain, but absolutely zero focus on what exactly Turquoise Mountain does. I've seen no questions asked about it in the media. So I've had a little dig around, and I found that John Oliver, its director of country operations, was the senior strategic advisor to the Director General of the Human Resources Development Fund of the Saudi government. This is an organization which focuses on increasing the amount of Saudis who are employed in the country. In addition to that, the creative director of his organization, Turquoise Mountain, is Dr. Thalia Kennedy, who, simultaneous to her work within Rory Stewart's organization, is an advisor to the Saudi Ministry of Culture. In addition to that, when we look at his trustees, we find Sir William Patey, who, of course, former Tory diplomat, served in numerous roles in numerous different theatres of war, from Iraq to Afghanistan. William Patey was also the Minister for Middle East Matters within the Tory government at one point, but he is part of the consultancy organization Control Risks. Now, we know that the director of Control Risks is former SAS Commander Michael Rose. It's essentially a private intelligence organization and security organization. Its president and CEO, Andreas Carlton Smith, for North America, was in the British Army for 10 years. We know that he was part of the SAS, that he had been involved in the commanding elements of the UK's terrorist team, and also was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry. But William Patey himself has served at Control Risks as a government and international relations advisor. And he later went on the same year to become executive director of HSBC. And when actually he was asked about the issue of providing weapons to human rights violators in the Gulf, he responded that people in the Gulf will say, you of all people should understand why evolutionary change is better than revolutionary change, essentially seeking to justify this relationship with the Gulf. We also know that he was the UK envoy for aviation security between 2015 2016, which would have meant very close dealings with arms companies. In addition to that, another trustee of Rory Stewart's organization in Afghanistan is Sir John Tusa, who was the presenter for BBC Two's Newsnight program. And he was also the managing director of the BBC World Service. Now, this was in the beginning of the 80s, when we do know that the extent of MI5 vetting of BBC employees extended all the way to people that worked in wardrobe and makeup at the institution. In addition to that, on his board of trustees is Henrietta Martin Fisher, who is currently the head of finance at the British Museum and formerly worked for the British Council. Now, literally, according to the British Council's own website, when it was founded as, quote unquote, an organ of international propaganda. And I'm quoting here verbatim. During the late 1920s, an influential group of civil servants became convinced that British values of parliamentary democracy could be subsumed by the rising tide of fascism. Their response was the British Committee for Relations with Other Countries, which became the British Council. Particular council initiatives included the teaching of English, but political messages always came along with the language tuition. Now, on the British Council's own website, it includes BP and BAE Systems among its quote unquote clients. Another person on the board of trustees of Rory Stewart's Afghanistan operation is Sir Richard Stagg, who was, of course, part of the Britain Abroad task force. Now, we know about Rory Stewart that he's part of the Special Forces Club. We know that it was reported by a security source in the Daily Telegraph, was quoted that he is former MI6. We also know, as Declassified has gone into, that he was part of Le Cercle and also the Trilateral Commission. Matt, could you explain what is this liberal obsession with Rory Stewart and who is he?
It goes back to this Russia nonsense that I was talking about. It's liberals have lost control and they are freaking out and they are scrambling around for someone who can save them. And because for me, I think liberalism is probably the most easily co-opted ideology. It's got the least kind of analytical framework to resist state co-option of any ideology or any of the mainstream ideologies that you see. And they want someone who's a kind of nice face and it can give interviews where he's kind of charming and endearing, and yet has politics which are completely blank, or at least just I say blank. Sorry, what I should say is supportive of the imperial machine and all the different elements that profit from it. And he is. So he's a good face for it. It's kind of like it's like Obama. Obama was a good face for the US empire, and actually the deep state want that. They don't want someone like Trump, who might allow them to do more outrageous things, but it's more disruptive to the machine running as it should if you have people who are a bit unpredictable. Boris Johnson the same. Boris Johnson is completely I'd say he's probably a psychopath, and he probably allows them to do a lot more of this kind of outrageous things than they could do previously. But he's not good for them because he's unpredictable. He's not as easy to keep in a box. Someone like Rory Stewart is perfect. He's a product, as you said. The Daily Telegraph reported that he was MI6 before he went into politics. He's connected. He says nice things about minority. He's not outwardly racist or homophobic. He presses all the buttons for liberals. So he's kind of a savior figure for them. Ironically, he's he is also embodies all the problems that put us where we are where we are today. You know, like he is a member of MI6. Well, sorry, I say he's a member of MI6. He was in MI6 before politics, according to the Daily Telegraph, according to this source in the Daily Telegraph. He was the chair of Le Cercle, which is a secret group which was founded in the early stages of the Cold War in France. It used to be called the Pinay Circle, and it was a sort of conservative, stretched into far right group which organized to defeat communism, and in all sorts of nefarious and covert ways that we're not even aware of now. But he was chair of this group in the early 2000s, and he never and at the time he was on a very powerful committee within Parliament and never notified Parliament, which is interesting. And the Circle, actually, there was a good bit of work done by the Daily Maverick in South Africa, who went to the archives in Pretoria and found that the Circle had been one of the had been funded by Apartheid South Africa, and in fact, a big priority for the Circle during the 80s was to defend and keep the regime in South Africa in place. So it doesn't sound like your average liberal hero to be a chair of a group that was doing that kind of stuff. But as I say, like the liberals don't or the liberal establishment don't interrogate these figures because they it's much easier just to accept what's presented to them by the media, and the media itself don't interrogate these characters. But we go further and further down the line of of these people, and the problems that create Brexit or create Trump just become worse and worse. And then when you have a figure who is a genuine progressive, who is a genuinely someone who might break with these reactionary regimes in the Gulf and with Israel, then the same liberal establishment destroy him, which is I'm talking about Jeremy Corbyn. So I think that it's impossible to reach the liberal establishment on this stuff because their function within British society and within discourse that's produced by the elite is to promote people like Rory Stewart, Tony Blair, and to destroy people like Jeremy Corbyn. So forget them, and forget people like that they celebrate, like Rory Stewart. Inevitably, they will have much more dark sides than you realize.
In consideration of the things that you have just said, considering the nature in which the drip feeding of news of parties taking place in Downing Street is happening, when we think of all of the crimes of Boris Johnson, even extending to his time as mayor, cutting the fire brigade to a ridiculous extent, and the link that that had to what happened at Grenfell, all of his crimes, all of his social violence, none of that is what he is demonized for. And how it will be historicized is that he is the party animal, the quintessential philanderer, well-intentioned, lovable rogue, but he just went too far.
Yeah.
What do you think the possibilities of an Operation Clockwork Orange type scenario being played out today in Britain? What do you think the chances of that are?
Explain that before I comment.
So Operation Clockwork Orange, while Colin Wallace, brilliant film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, he's got a brilliant study done into his case by Paul Foote. He was working in intelligence in Northern Ireland for the British, and his speciality was planting stories in the press. One of the kind of stories that they were planting were fake satanic rituals to spread chaos within mainly the Catholic community. Later on, what he revealed is at one point he was approached by someone from MI5 who relayed to him Operation Clockwork Orange, which was the gathering of information on serving ministers in government, top of the list being Harold Wilson, and identifying 4 different vulnerabilities and building up that information and putting that information into the public sphere. There's a lot else out there about the campaign against Harold Wilson to bring him down, but Operation Clockwork Orange was basically the collecting of smears on serving politicians, and particularly the Prime Minister, and the tactical and strategic leaking of those to acquiescent cooperative journalists in the media. I mean, it's a bit of a mad one. It is a bit.
No, I mean, I wouldn't like to talk on it because there's no evidence of it. So, but there's no. It is interesting. I mean, you can do an analysis of why the media is going for Boris Johnson like it is. Number one, it wouldn't be doing that if Jeremy Corbyn was still the leader of the Labour Party. Absolutely no way. They would be softening up the population for Jeremy Corbyn. There's absolutely no way. Number two, it is true that Boris Johnson, I think, does have enemies within the sort of what's called the deep state. You know, that number one, that part of the establishment was very against Brexit, and Boris Johnson obviously was a leading figure in that campaign. And number two, as we said earlier, like, he is quite unstable and probably not a good sort of figurehead for those kind of interests. So there are reasons why I don't know if there's active operations to get rid of him, but there are the reason that the media is going for him so hard is definitely related to the wider political context. And the point about it is, and this goes back, I don't want to bang on about liberals too much, but for them, he's a like a punch bag, right? Whereas he will be replaced by someone else who's exactly the same. He might be a bit, the person who follows him might be a bit better in front of the cameras and not quite as outrageous and wild, but Rishi Sunak, like, all the same policies of impoverishing the poor, of imperialism abroad, they all carry on, because that is how the whole British state is set up to run that system. And they want someone a bit better, a bit more efficient and a bit better to do it. But that's who they want. They want someone like Starmer, maybe, or Rory Stewart. You know, that's who they want. So it is interesting to me why everyone's going for Boris in such a extreme way. And there definitely are more. There's reasons for it, which is not just outrage over the parties. Obviously, the parties are outrageous, but as you say, if you can, and this goes back to the media role as well, and priming the population to support imperialism is what they choose to get angry about. And you mentioned a bunch of stuff that Boris has done. He was Foreign Secretary, a very important part of the Saudi assault on Yemen, and that is, in the modern era, the worst crime that's been committed in the world. Millions of children starving, like Saudi war crimes every week, bombing schools, hospitals, school buses, awful. The UK government is complicit, and we actually interviewed a Foreign Office whistleblower called Molly Moridi, who was working there when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary. She said that he would joke around and laugh when they were trying to brief him about the civilian casualties in Yemen. That's the kind of guy he is. But yet, she's never been interviewed on mainstream TV. Never been interviewed. Yeah. So what? It's so bananas. And this goes back to the censorship by omission. So what the media feeds people, and they get angry about, they think is that because of that, they live in a free society with a free media. Because, oh look, we're getting information where they're criticizing the Prime Minister. But the fact is that they protect the information from the population, which actually implicates the whole of the establishment, and actually damage establishment interests if they stopped arming the Saudis, because you're talking about BAE and all the different elements that benefit from that relationship. That will never get exposed. That will never get problematized, because that will hurt the establishment. They'll allow the criticism which effectively means they can get rid of Boris and put someone else exactly the same as him. And that is the information that gets out, and that's the way that the discourse is controlled. So, and this is my problem with this. It was the same with Trump. When they get rid of Boris, like, it's going to be the same. When they get rid of the Tory party and Starmer comes in, it's going to be the same. There'll be different sort of there'll be definitely differences in like small surface differences, but effectively Labour are voting through all the reactionary stuff that the Tories are doing. They won't get a difference, and this is the perfect system for the establishment, where you just go between two. You give the appearance of democracy. You get Starmer in, you get Boris in, you get Rishi Sunak in. Doesn't matter. We are still running things. You know, that's how it goes. And it's impossible to kind of damage that system, or at least have an impact on it, because anyone who doesn't play that game, which is the Westminster pantomime, is marginalized. You're not relevant because you're not talking on the same terms. If you're talking about the Saudi war in Yemen and UK support, people, because no one's heard about it in the media, they turn off. Whereas if you're talking about the parties, then you get an audience and everyone wants to listen to you. So the way it works is it marginalizes, completely silences anyone who's actually trying to talk about the real important issues of, like, the world's worst humanitarian disaster, which we could probably help stop if people became aware of it. So, I mean, that's how it's always worked like that. You know, there's no power system that's going to promote journalists, promote thinkers, promote activists that are going to damage their ability to project power. So they marginalize them.
Yeah, essentially, we live in a two-party, one policy kind of state, really. Small tinkering around the edges. One of the things that crossed my mind was largely touted in the mainstream media as the leader of the quote-unquote pork pie conspiracy to remove Boris Johnson is the MP for Rutland, Alicia Kearns. Now, she was elected in 2019, but prior to that, she was the director of an organization by the name of Global Influence. Now, Global Influence on their website says that it's a PR firm. It says that its clients are the FCO, the Foreign Office, US State Department, and NATO. When we also look at Alicia Kearns' history, she was formerly a senior press officer at the Ministry of Defense. She also worked on the production of the NATO summit, but she was also the cross-government lead for countering Daesh in the Syria and Iraq, working for the Foreign Office. So there's definitely question marks about Alicia Kearns and what her history is prior to becoming an MP. Of course, the Daily Mail has recently reported with the headline, MP said to be at the heart of pork pie conspiracy against Boris, takes her baby and nanny on a Commons trip to Ukraine. That is the 22nd of January, 2022. So she's clearly connected with Britain's military machinations around the world. And the fact that people like her, like Rory Stewart and Keir Starmer, are now so freely calling for the resignation of Boris Johnson surely must be an indication of sorts. And as we know, this nature of drip feeding stories is the signature of these types of agencies and institutions that we are talking about. Now, I'm aware we've taken up quite a lot of your time, Matt. So just for the last question, you have really done peerless research, actually, into the conflicts of interest which have been at the heart of the British state's dealing with political prisoner Julian Assange, from Lady Arbuthnot to Burnett. Now, would you just be able to take us through with a fairly concise timeline of this process and how skewed and clearly unjust it has been?
Yeah, I mean, I've mostly covered the period from 2018 onwards. But it starts way before, obviously, in 2010. And actually the journalist has done the work on this, and it's brilliant work, which she's labored on for years now, is Stefania Marisi, who's been trying to get documents from the CPS about what was happening with the Swedish case, which came up soon after Collateral Murder was put online, and then subsequent to that, when Assange was in the embassy, and she the little bit she's got, they said they deleted most of the information she wants to get hold of, but the little bit she's got show that there was real machinations to try and keep that case going when the Swedes might have closed it because they wanted a pretext to keep Assange in the embassy, and probably other stuff that we're not aware of. Anyway, but that's kind of more known about. I kind of covered it from 2018, which starts with the Westminster Chief Magistrate, Lady Arbuthnot, and she was ruling on a case. She made 2 rulings on a case in February 2018, and she is kind of deeply embedded in the British establishment through her husband, who is a former Tory defence minister, and was co-director of a consultancy with the ex-head of MI6, Sir John Scarlett. And I found with her that she'd actually been funded by partner organisations of the Foreign Office to go on foreign trips before she ruled on Assange. You know, such blatant conflicts of interest. Her husband is, as I said, co-director of a consultancy with the ex-head of MI6 before she was ruling on Assange. Huge conflict of interest. And then he was also involved with the Henry Jackson Society. He was sat on their political council and was promoting them in Parliament around the time she was ruling on the Assange case. Henry Jackson Society, which doesn't disclose its funders, despite being a registered charity, was one of the major civil society organisations which was running a campaign against Assange ever since the start, basically. So he was part of this group that was running a campaign. Well, I say running a campaign, I don't know that, but they were definitely speaking frequently in the media about Assange. So there's that. Then it comes up to more recently, and Vanessa Baraitser, who made the decision last year not to extradite, but interestingly, not on based. She agreed with every dot and comma of the U.S. indictment from Trump's DOJ, which basically kills any kind of national security reporting on the U.S. if you're in a UK jurisdiction, because she eventually barred the extradition on health grounds, saying that and the fact that he would be held in oppressive conditions. But precedent about his extradition being sent for his supposed crimes, that's set now, you know. But I tried to get information about. She was an interesting character because she had absolutely no public profile, quite rare for a judge, literally none. And I tried to get a list of her cases that she'd ruled on since she became a magistrate, and that was blocked. And this is kind of public information, should be public information. It's not. I didn't ask for the names. I just asked for what the rulings were, and in fact, I did ask for the names because they're public cases. There's no reason. I didn't ask for details that weren't public, sort of thing. Anyway, that was blocked. So what I did was do another request for the same information of a different judge that was actually appointed on the same day as her, and it wasn't blocked. So I don't know why there was that discrepancy, but it does indicate that there was a desire of the Ministry of Justice to really just shut down on getting any information about her out at all. And then what I did subsequent to that was to go through Westlaw. In fact, Westlaw is a database of all legal cases, they deposit quite a lot of information about legal cases in there. And in fact, Factiva is a sort of searchable press clippings platform. So I went through those to try and construct a case list myself. And I can't remember how many we found in the end. I think I found about 36 cases or something along those lines. And every single one she'd extradited apart from one. So she had like a 96 possession extradition record. Obviously, in the end, she didn't extradite, but actually on interesting grounds, as I say, and this gets more sort of important as you move on. So then from there, the US were given the right to appeal on a number of grounds, a wide number of grounds, and they eventually won that in the most recent ruling. And who gave that ruling? It went to the High Court. It was, and the most senior judge on the High Court and in the England and Wales is Lord Chief Justice Burnett. And it turns out, what is a 40-year, they met at university, 40-year good friend of Sir Alan Duncan, who was foreign minister from 2016 to 19 and responsible for the Americas, and was the key player from the UK side with getting Assange out of the embassy. Not only that, more interestingly than that, he was a very emotionally involved in the case, hated Assange, clearly, had a deep, despised him deeply. And he was negotiating with the Ecuadorians for 3 years. He was in place when he was eventually sprung from the embassy in April 2019. And in his diaries, which is where I got this information, he says that he had been a good friend of Burnett since university. He also said he talked with him on the phone in 2018, and Burnett briefed him on a dinner he'd had with Theresa May at Chequers a couple of days before. Now that's the bit of the phone call that he put in his diaries. We don't know what else was said. And then after that, on the eve of the 2019 election, he had a birthday party at Beefsteak Club, which is just next to Leicester Square. This is Duncan did, Sir Alan Duncan, and Burnett was present with his wife. Also, there was William Hague, who was Foreign Secretary when the UK refused to recognise Ecuador's granting of asylum to Assange. Another person who was there was Salma Shah, who was an advisor to Sajid Javid, who was the Home Secretary who certified the initial US extradition requests. They were all at this dinner, Burnett. And so we published it. We contacted Burnett and we contacted Duncan. Burnett sent an email back saying that he had confirming it had been friends with Duncan since he was at university. We asked both of them if they'd ever discussed the Assange case. They said no. And not one mainstream media organization picked it up. Not one. And so again, these inconvenient stories, these inconvenient truths are buried, completely buried. So I was listening to the BBC actually the other day. I shouldn't do it, I know, but every now and then I happen to walk past the radio and it's on. And they were discussing the Assange case. It was after the ruling that subsequent to that, Burnett is allowing an application to the Supreme Court to appeal their decision. But anyway, it was discussing that, and you listen to how it's presented. It was complete. It was literally it would be written by the US government, the whole press report. And it was kind of amazing to me because, as I say, I'm not exposed to the BBC too much. I try and avoid it. But when you are, and you just hear it, and you hear every kind of truth that could be that is needed to understand specifically that case, but it generalizes across everything, really, is left out. And in fact, I think you were the one who tweeted after that Yahoo News report came out, which was 30 ex-officials in the US. So very serious people came out to Yahoo News to say that the CIA had been asked to draw up plans to assassinate Assange. You know, it's a big deal. The British were asked if they would do the shooting, and they said yes. So you're talking about a foreign power planning to assassinate a journalist in the heart of London, and the British agreeing to it. And I think you tweeted about it. The only part of the BBC which picked it up, and is to this day, not just that at the time, they've never reported it, was BBC Somali. And I don't even know what the BBC Somali report said, but that's probably not a very good report. But the point is, like, it's incredible when you see it in such bold terms that the population is completely guarded from any information which the establishment don't want them to see. And And in the Assange case, it's the same. As I said, like I've gone through some of the conflicts of interest, and there's a lot. If the population were exposed to it, it might change things. You know, like if any of the stuff was reported in the Guardian, it might change things. So in some ways, the mainstream media is complicit in its continued persecution because they are not doing any investigations of what's happening around the process. And one of the most terrifying things about the Assange case for me, because obviously he exposed the US empire, but he exposed the media as well. But for me, the scariest part of everything he exposed is the judiciary and the legal system in this country. It's so clear that it's been captured. It's so clear that if certain elements within the state want to get you, you have no protections from the judiciary or the legal system. They have been completely captured in this case. And if it can happen in this case, obviously it can happen in any case. So and part of the reason that they get away with it is because of the conspiracy of silence by the media and journalists. They just not cover it, so people don't know. And when you sit someone down and explain to them, yeah, well, the judge just found against him has been friends for 40 years with the guy who orchestrated his arrest. They went to their birthday party. He went to his birthday party with his wife and these other people that were involved in the case. People are like, what? That can't be right. That doesn't make sense. Surely that can't be right. And then you're like, no, it is. So the only way to stop this kind of realization from people is to bury the information, and that information is buried. And as I say, it's very clear in the Assange process, but it goes across the board. I mean, like we mentioned Yemen earlier, which I think is the most horrific modern crime. You know, like the Saudis, they have absolutely no regard for human life. They are bombing kids. They're bombing it's a completely punitive campaign, which is littered with war crimes. And yet the kind of UK involvement in it, it's hardly been written about at all in the mainstream media. The journalist that's covered it more than anyone is Phil Miller, who works for the Declassified. No one else has even got close to what he's doing. And actually, as I said about the Assange case, it might change things. If this was reported every day in the media and problematized and made into a scandal, because it's a much bigger scandal than Downing Street parties, it would stop. But yet, what the corporate media columnists, what they focused on, they spent years anguishing, pained columns about should we bomb Syria to help the Syrians. Not one of those people, not one, I don't think, has ever called for us to stop harming the Saudis. So it's this weird psychology when you get in the corporate media where you only care about human suffering if the answer to it is sending bombs. When you can do something really, really easy, like just stop arms, stop support, which might change the situation overnight, they're not interested. In fact, it doesn't even come on their radar. So, yeah, that's what we're up against. But that's why independent media, just to finish, that is the future. In the UK, there's lots of exciting stuff happening, which is why they attack us so much, because anyone who sits outside the mainstream gets it in the neck.
As you were saying, you know, what's happened in Yemen, far more people have died from starvation than have died directly from bullets or bombs. However, the farms have been bombed almost 1,000 times in Yemen. The water system, the sewage system, causing a spread of cholera. You've seen weddings, detention centers bombed. These are genocidal tactics in terms of attacking a society. Now, for me, it's most illustrative of Islamophobia as a form of class war, because from Tommy Robinson to Katie Hopkins to the Sun newspaper to the Daily Mail, if they were true to their Islamophobia, surely their first point of call would be BAE Systems, because BAE Systems is arming this regime in such a way. However, you've never heard those words come out the mouths of the Henry Jackson Society, of Tommy Robinson, of Katie Hopkins. Never once would they mention BAE Systems or Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. And this really reveals what their project is as being a punch down project quite squarely. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. Hopefully we'll be able to have another great conversation. Our first interview was actually wildly popular for the the scale of what we're doing independently. It would have been seen overall, clips from it would have been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. So it's fantastic to share this conversation with you again. Keep up the great work. Stay well, stay strong, and we will talk again soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, man. You too. Take care, man.
Nice one.